So you've seen the advice from 7 incredible landscape photographers on composition in my last video. What does it all add up to? Today I'm unpacking their insights to find out where they overlap, where they diverge, and whether any of them actually agree on what makes a composition work. So let's dive into their unique perspectives and see if there's a common thread, or if composition really is as personal as it seems. I mean, we've all been there, right? Standing in front of an epic landscape at sunrise, muttering to ourselves, rule of thirds, no wait, maybe golden ratio, hang on, should I use leading lines? Is that rock a foreground element or just, a rock? Meanwhile, the perfect light is fading fast. But here's what I noticed while studying these guys' work, and trust me, I watch so many hours of their content that my YouTube algorithm now thinks I live in Scotland. These photographers have an approach that's both simpler and more profound than memorizing a photography rule book. They know when to break all those composition rules and when to use them. What really struck me as I watched each of these photographers was how differently they approached the exact same goal, creating a composition that captivates. But here's the thing, no one style is the best. It's more like they each add a piece to the puzzle. So let's walk through some of these ideas and see what resonates with you. These photographers keep talking about composition rules, but when you really pay attention to what they're doing and look past all the technical talk, a surprising pattern emerges. You see, despite all the common composition rules that we all hear about, these guys keep coming back to fundamental approaches that transcend the usual guidelines. So what I'm going to share might seem slightly controversial, but that's me, especially if you're caught up in the rules or rules mindset. But stick with me, because this approach could make some significant transformations to your photography. So I'll break it down a bit about what emerged from analysing these guys. We all know about the rule of thirds, leading lines and foreground interest, etc., but nothing revolutionary there. As a professional photographer myself, I've been using these elements for years. What's interesting is seeing how consistently certain patterns emerge across all of their teachings. Take Mark Denney's puzzle piece approach. It's fascinating, not because it's new, but because it articulates something many of us professionals do instinctively. We identify the key elements that draw us to a scene and then work out how to arrange them effectively. Then there's Nigel Danson's emphasis on diagonals, not just as leading lines, but as a fundamental way to create energy in an image. And when you look at how Mads breaks down his tool of space concept, you can see how these approaches all interconnect. What really struck me when watching all this content wasn't that these photographers were showing anything revolutionary, but rather how they explain these fundamental concepts in their own way. Then there's Mark Denney's puzzle piece concept. While he presents it as an aha moment, what he's really doing is putting into words the process we go through when we're working a scene, identifying the strong elements and finding ways to make them work together. It's really interesting to see how he breaks down this concept for his audience in the video.
What do you love about this scene? Take the things that you love in step 1, and those are the pieces of your puzzle. So step 2, you just put the pieces of your puzzle together.
Now, Nigel Danson's focus on diagonals is particularly fascinating. He takes something that most of us professionals actually utilise naturally and creates a really systematic way to explain it. When he talks about opposing diagonals, he's really describing the way we instinctively look for dynamic relationships within a scene.
So a diagonal is powerful because if you think about a building, if as soon as it goes like that, it looks like it's going to fall over. So a diagonal creates a sense of movement in a photo. You can get a shot like this with this incredible road leading into the image. It works really well if you have that road at a diagonal because your eye just wants to follow it. Already your eye wants to follow a road, but if you create a diagonal as well, you want to follow it. And this image here has got a number of diagonals that really, really help. So we've got this leading line here that takes you all the way up and actually goes back in that direction. But we've also got another parallel line here and another opposing line here. So these lines and this line are all meeting here. So your eye is just going all the way there. And that's created by diagonals. So this is another good example of a leading line being a diagonal into an image. And again, this has got multiple diagonals in it. There's this diagonal here, but there's also diagonals coming from this corner as well, which are opposing that diagonal, which is sort of leading your eye into the image.
And this is where looking across their content becomes really valuable. You see patterns in how they each tackle those challenging situations we all face as professionals. Take those flat grey days that most photographers avoid. Thomas Heaton shows how he handles those by focusing on relationships between elements rather than light, something that resonates with my own approach to these conditions.
And it's just, I'll say, the contrast of the reflection on the water, should I say. And it's just I don't know, this image might work, it might not, but it was enough for me to stop and set up and capture the image. All in all, I'd say it was definitely worthwhile.
What's particularly interesting to me is how each of them handles the balance between technical rules and intuitive composition. Alister Benn's approach is to what he calls meaningful depth. Isn't just about throwing in foreground elements, because that's what the rulebook says. It's about understanding when the depth actually adds to the story that you're trying to tell. And Ian Worth's coastal work demonstrates this perfectly. He's not just applying rules mechanically, he's actually showing how to read a scene and respond to what it gives you.
When I arrive at a scene I believe is worthy of a photograph like this one, I simply just take a moment. I leave the camera in the bag, I observe the scene, breathe in the air, soak in the atmosphere and just enjoy the moment for a couple of minutes. Quite often a photo will present itself to me rather than me having to hunt around for it.
When you compare this to what Simon approaches his subjects with, even though he comes from a wildlife background, you can see the same principles at work. And what I find particularly fascinating is how these different teaching approaches actually reflect the evolution many of us has gone through over the years as professional photographers. Remember, when we first started out rigidly following every composition rule. Now watch how Mads specifically addresses this. He acknowledges the rule of thirds, but then he shows how breaking free from it opens up so many more possibilities.
The classic and basic way of using the rule of thirds is simply just to put your subject on one of the intersection points, and whoop-de-doo, magically you now have a strong composition. The problem is that by using it like this, you may actually end up throwing your photo way out of balance. The thing about the rule of thirds is that you can most often actually overlay the grid on most photos and force through and say that the photographer has used the rule of thirds. However, that's not really how you use the rule of thirds. And the first rule or tool I want to talk about is the tool of space.
And something else that emerged from watching all this content. Notice how none of these guys get caught up in what I call the composition checkbox syndrome. You know what I mean? When new photographers have a tendency to try and tick every composition rule and cram everything into a single image. Instead, they're all showing how to let the scene dictate the approach. Now let's break down the key composition approaches these pros consistently use. The first one is the tool of space from Mads. He breaks down something that experienced photographers do instinctively, understanding how subjects need room to breathe in the frame. When he talks about making sure that subjects face into the frame rather than out of it, he's articulating a principle that goes way beyond just following rules.
It's actually a compositional tool that I see many new photographers struggle with. So let's dig into a few examples. In this first photo here, we have me standing in a waterfall, and I have actually used the tool of space right here. If you have any kind of perceivable front or back to either human, an animal, a building, car, a boat, anything where you can imagine that there is a front, that front has in most circumstances to be turned into the photo. So now I'm just going to turn myself to the side, and you can see right here, I'm looking out of the photo. I'm not looking into the photo. Here I'm looking into the photo. The front of your subject have to be turned towards the middle. And that is what the tool of space says.
Giving subjects room to breathe and face into the frame. This isn't just about empty space. It's about understanding how elements need room to exist within an image. When photographing anything with a perceivable front, like a building, person, or an animal, ensure it faces into the frame rather than looking away. And the puzzle piece method I've talked about before of Mark Denney's. Identifying what you love about a scene and arranging the elements in your composition. You start by taking like a mental picture of what draws you into the scene and work on arranging those elements in a way that creates the strongest composition. This approach really simplifies the composition process by focusing what matters rather than following rigid rules.
What do you love about this scene? What do you like about it? Why do you want to point your camera at this particular scene? And this is the real aha moment for me. This is really what changed the way that I look at composition while I'm on location. It kind of made things seem a lot more, I guess I should say, less mentally straining. This process here really simplifies it, really streamlines it. So you basically take the things that you love in step one, and those are the pieces of your puzzle. So step two is you just put the pieces of your puzzle together.
And Nigel Danson's power of diagonals, using both obvious and perceived diagonals to create energy. Diagonals create movement and depth in images, whether they're actual lines in the landscape or implied lines created by the arrangement of elements. Look for opportunities to create opposing diagonals for added dynamic tension.
You know that this image has got depth because you know that that pier is the same width all the way, but it's getting thinner, and that's created by these perspective lines of diagonals. And diagonals have got a really good role to play in lots of things, but one of them is creating depth in your image. So a diagonal is a great way of creating a three-dimensional image. The next thing to think about is leading lines. A diagonal creates energy and movement in an image. It helps your eye move. By placing a diagonal in an image of very straight lines like this one, you can create something that has got more, it just looks more alive, I suppose. It also can create something that's very dramatic. So having that diagonal across these very straight trees in the background creates something that's just a little bit different. It's a little bit more dynamic. But I use diagonals all the time in waterfalls, just by going and standing to the side, which is such a powerful tool in photography. Just take your tripod. In fact, don't even put your camera on a tripod to begin with. Just move from left to right, get your position right. You can create that diagonal, and that adds to, in this case, the flow of this water. So the water is, you automatically think this water's flowing, but you've also got, in this case, this diagonal that's adding to it and creating this more dynamic scene.
Meaningful depth, which is what Alister Benn spoke about, only including foreground elements that add value to the story. Don't just add foreground interest because it's a rule. Ensure it contributes to the overall composition and enhances the image.
By removing the uncool from this scene and allowing the more important content, the cool of the composition, to sit in the frame in a much more powerful manner. By removing all those distractions, it becomes very clear what this photograph is about, this little tree growing out of the cut-off old growth tree. Removing the cool is the best way of making your compositions more concise.
Sometimes a really clean, simple foreground can be far more effective than forced, complex compositions. Balance and visual weight, creating relationships between elements within the frame. And this goes beyond just positioning. It's about understanding how different elements interact with each other and create harmony between them. So consider how light, shadow, colour and form all work together to create balance. Next, we have a scene within a scene. So finding intimate compositions in really larger landscapes. Don't always feel compelled to capture the entire vista. Sometimes the most compelling images come from isolating smaller elements within the broader landscape. This approach works really well in challenging lighting conditions. And the other thing you can do, if you're actually trying to create a story with a particular subject, you can get your big wide angle shots, but then get a couple of all the intimate details and put them together, and it tells the story of the whole place. Then we have adapting conditions, maintaining really strong compositions regardless of the light or the weather. Instead of waiting for the perfect conditions, learn to work with what you have. Different lighting and weather conditions often really require different compositional approaches, but the fundamental principles remain the same. Bad weather can really often create opportunities for really unique compositions. And synthesis. Something else that really emerged from all these hours of content is how each of these guys approaches what I call visual weight. Nigel Danson shows this through his work with diagonals, but watch how Alister Benn achieves the same thing through his use of light and shadow. Different techniques Same fundamental understanding of balance. And the way Simon translates his wildlife composition skills to landscapes raises another interesting point. Whether you're shooting a bird or a mountain, those core principles of space, balance, and relationship between elements remain constants.
By too many subjects, I mean a photo where nothing is obviously the main feature. And if you ask 4 people what the subject is, you could get 4 different answers. In this photo, what's the subject? The lighthouse? The sun popping out from the clouds? The reflecting water? Or this reflection on the rocks? Too many subjects in this one means that it isn't clear where the viewer should look. But in this photo here, I have made it clear where your eye should be drawn. Or in this photo of big waves, none of them are standing out as the main feature. But in this shot here, we know who the main actor is. Or in this photo, make it simple. Sometimes less is more.
Whether you're shooting a bird or a mountain, those core principles of space, balance, and relationship between elements remain constant. So my conclusion, well, perhaps the most valuable thing that comes from watching all these guys isn't just their individual techniques. It's seeing how the fundamental principles keep surfacing regardless of their personal style or approach, whether it's Mark's puzzle pieces or Mad's space tools. They all have different ways of achieving the same goal and creating compositions that really work. So I've actually created a free PDF guide summarising all of these photographers' techniques, which you can download using the link in the description. It breaks down each of these approaches in detail, making it easier to reference when you're out in the field. So drop a comment below with your thoughts on this approach. Have you tried shooting based on feeling first? And if so, how did it change your images? So what have we learned from my last video? These photographers aren't just following rules, they're actually breaking them, bending them and making them their own. They're not just capturing a scene, they're creating an experience. So the next time you're out shooting, remember my thoughts and give it a go if you wish. Don't just think about the rules, feel the scene and let your intuition guide you, and most importantly, have fun. You can break every composition rule and still create an image that moves people to tears. Conversely, you can follow every rule perfectly and create an image that's about as emotionally engaging as a microwave. The real secret these guys share isn't about rules or technical perfection, it's about emotional authenticity. They've mastered the technical stuff so thoroughly that it becomes unconscious, leaving their conscious minds free to focus on the emotional core of each scene. They all have and use their muscle memory and don't need to waste any time thinking about the technical side at all, as they've spent so many hours in the field practicing their craft. Think of it this way. Composition rules are like grammar rules in writing. Yes, you need to know them, but imagine trying to write a love letter while consciously thinking about proper semicolon usage. The greatest landscape photos are love letters to nature, not technical demonstrations. The truth is you can follow every composition rule perfectly and still create something that feels completely empty. I've got folders full of technically correct images that I'll never show anyone because they're about as inspiring as a parking lot. And a pro tip that nobody tells you, sometimes the most powerful composition techniques is simply waiting, not for better light, but for your own emotional connection to happen.